Imagine the roar of an engine slicing through the quiet streets of 1960s America. The muscle car era was just beginning a revolution of speed, power, and raw steel that would come to define a generation. Names like Mustang, Camaro, and Charger became cultural icons, etched forever into American history. But behind the chrome grills and thunderous exhausts, there's a story almost no one knows. A story about a man whose brilliance helped ignite that very revolution, yet whose name has been all but erased. He wasn't just another engineer following orders. He was a black man in a world where the automotive industry was dominated almost entirely by white faces and white voices. He had to fight for every ounce of recognition, pushing through barriers that went far beyond the drafting table. His designs and ideas helped give birth to the first true American muscle car. Yet you won't find him in most history books, and you won't hear his name celebrated alongside the legends. This is not just the story of an engineer. It's the story of talent overlooked, of genius buried under prejudice, and of how one man's vision helped shape an entire movement in American car culture. As we peel back the layers, you might find yourself asking, why was he forgotten? And what would history look like if his story had been told? The engine is running, the gears are shifting, and the road ahead is filled with both triumph and injustice. This is where our journey begins. To understand his story, we need to step back into Detroit during the late 1950s and early 1960s. The beating heart of America's automotive empire, factories stretched for miles, their smokestacks painting the sky with a haze of progress. The big three, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, were locked in fierce competition, each racing to produce faster, flashier cars that could dominate both the streets and the sales charts. This was more than just business. It was pride, patriotism, and the promise of the American dream on wheels. But inside those factories and design studios, not everyone had an equal seat at the table. For a black engineer, walking into that world meant stepping into a place where your talent was often questioned. Before you even picked up a pencil, it meant long hours of proving yourself, knowing that even your best work might be credited to someone else. And yet, despite these challenges, one man refused to let those barriers define him. He brought with him a passion for performance, an obsession with pushing engines and bodies beyond what was considered possible at the time. He looked at cars not just as machines, but as symbols of freedom. He had fought harder than most to claim. His vision didn't just match the ambitions of Detroit, it often surpassed them, while others were focused on styling or marketing slogans. He was sketching ideas that could actually reshape what an American car could be. And soon, those ideas would find their way into a project that would change everything. A project destined to create a new category of automobile that didn't exist yet. A project that would launch the era of the muscle car. The early 1960s marked a turning point. American youth were hungry for something new, cars that weren't just transportation, but statements. The baby boom generation was coming of age. Rock and roll was shaking the culture, and horsepower became a language all its own. Automakers knew they had to capture this energy or risk being left behind. Inside General Motors, a secret project was quietly taking shape. Pontiac, once seen as a conservative brand, wanted to reinvent itself. Engineers were tasked with building something bold, a car that looked sleek, sounded mean, and packed more power under the hood than anyone thought practical. This was more than a new model. It was the start of a revolution. Our engineer was at the heart of it. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but his ideas carried weight. He studied engine configurations, chassis strength, and torque delivery like a scientist unlocking a code. Where others saw limitations, he saw opportunities. His technical contributions helped shape what would become the Pontiac GTO, the car many historians call America's first true muscle car. The GTO wasn't just fast, it was unapologetic. It represented rebellion in metal form, and it spoke directly to a generation that wanted to break free from the rules of their parents. But behind the glory of the launch, behind the cheers from car enthusiasts and the booming sales, the man who had poured his mind and heart into its creation was pushed into the shadows. His fingerprints were all over the car, but his name was nowhere to be found. And that silence wasn't an accident. It was the result of a system designed to overlook him. When the Pontiac GTO hit the streets in 1964, it was like lightning in a bottle. The car sold far beyond expectations, sparking a craze that spread through every neighborhood, from small-town drag strips to big city boulevards. Teenagers dreamed of owning one, magazines praised its power, and rivals scrambled to catch up. What had once been a quiet project inside, GM exploded into a national phenomenon, the birth of the muscle car era. But for the engineer who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the celebration was bittersweet. While executives and public figures were praised as visionaries, his contributions were brushed aside, credited instead to men who looked the part in glossy press photos. In meetings, his ideas were treated as if they had magically come from someone else. He had built the backbone of performance, but history would record other names as the pioneers. The truth was harsh. In 1960s America, a black man in engineering was rarely given his due. Opportunities were scarce, promotions even scarcer, and recognition often impossible. The automotive world, like much of society, wasn't built to celebrate his achievements. Even when his designs broke barriers, the barrier of race remained unshaken. Still, he refused to give up. He kept pushing boundaries, refining engines, and shaping performance in ways most people will never realize. And as the GTO stormed the market, it became clear that his vision had not only created a car, but ignited an entire cultural wave. The irony? Everyone knew the GTO as the car that started it all, but almost no one knew the man who helped make it real. And that painful disconnect would only deepen as the years went on. As the muscle car era exploded, the race for horsepower turned into an ULAT war. Ford unveiled the Mustang, Chevrolet pushed the Camaro, Dodge launched the Charger. Every company wanted a piece of the action. Street races lit up Friday nights, magazines ran cover stories on quarter-mile times, and Detroit became the epicenter of American speed culture. Our engineer, though, wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing perfection. Every project he touched carried his obsession for balance power. That wasn't just loud, but efficient drivetrains that could endure punishment. Designs that weren't only bold, but mechanically sound. His colleagues often relied on his calculations, his quiet genius guiding decisions that others would later claim as their own. But outside the drafting room, the world was changing. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Marches, protests, and speeches filled the headlines, demanding justice and equality across the nation. Inside corporate boardrooms, however, progress moved far more slowly. For a black engineer in Detroit, proving his worth over and over again wasn't enough to guarantee recognition. The unwritten rule was clear: stay in the background, let others take the spotlight. And yet, without his work, the spotlight itself might never have existed. The GTO had sparked a new identity for Pontiac, giving the brand a rebellious edge that connected with young America. His fingerprints were still everywhere, in the powertrain designs, in the structural innovations, in the hidden tweaks that made the impossible possible. It's here that the story sharpens into contrast. On one hand, the golden age of muscle cars, roaring with pride and patriotism. On the other, a man whose achievements were hidden in plain sight. His legacy slipping further from view, even as the cars he shaped became legends. By the late 1960s, muscle cars were no longer just cars. They were a cultural movement. Songs were written about them, movies showcased them, and every teenager wanted to be seen behind the wheel of one. Pontiac, Chevrolet, Ford, and Dodge became household names in ways that transcended the showroom floor. The GTO was still considered the spark that lit the fuse, the car that gave permission for this horsepower revolution to exist. Yet the man who had quietly helped make it possible was still invisible. Within the walls of the company, he was respected for his technical skill, but rarely celebrated. He sat in meetings where his solutions solved problems that baffled others, only to watch managers present his work as their own. He was a ghost in the very history he was helping to build. What made his story even more tragic was the contrast. Some of his white counterparts, who contributed far less to these groundbreaking projects, became legends of the auto industry. Their names appeared in magazines, their faces were photographed for the press, their careers skyrocketed. Meanwhile, his remained tethered by a glass ceiling that was almost impossible to shatter in corporate America at that time. And yet, he kept going. Because for him, engineering wasn't about glory, it was about the machine. He found pride in the roar of an engine tuned just right, in the thrill of performance numbers that beat expectations. In knowing that his fingerprints were on vehicles people loved. Even if the world never gave him credit, he knew what he had built. But as emissions laws tightened, insurance companies cracked down, and oil crises loomed, the muscle car era itself began to wobble. And as the golden age of horsepower dimmed, so too did the chance for his name to ever truly rise into the light. The 1970s arrived with a harsh dose of reality. Muscle cars, once the kings of the road, began to lose their crown. Rising insurance premiums, strict emissions regulations, and the oil crisis of 1973 hit Detroit like a hammer. Suddenly, the appetite for massive V8 engines shrank, and the very cars that had defined a generation were now seen as impractical, even irresponsible. For our engineer, this shift was especially painful. He had poured years of his life into creating cars that symbolized freedom, youth, and raw power. Now, boardrooms demanded efficiency, smaller engines, and compromises that went against everything the muscle car stood for. Projects he believed in were shelved, prototypes scrapped before they ever had a chance to prove themselves. But beneath the disappointment was another reality: his legacy had never been properly recorded. As the industry pivoted to survival mode, the contributions of individuals like him were buried even deeper under the weight of corporate restructuring and selective storytelling. While some names still made it into the history books, his remained absent, erased by time and bias. And yet, if you drove a GTO, a Firebird, or even the early muscle-influenced Chevrolets, you were experiencing the echoes of his work. His engineering solutions didn't vanish when the ERA shifted. They became part of the DNA of American performance cars. His invisible hand still guided the way engines were balanced, the way frames handled stress, the way speed was delivered with precision. It's this irony that makes his story so haunting. He helped shape the golden age of American muscle cars, yet as the era faded, so did his name, leaving behind a legacy that enthusiasts celebrate every day without even knowing who to thank. Decades later, the legend of the muscle car never truly died. Enthusiasts kept restoring, racing, and cherishing the machines of the 1960s and 70s, ensuring that cars like the Pontiac GTO remained immortal in the hearts of millions. Classic car shows filled with chrome and nostalgia became cultural staples. Yet the history told at these gatherings was often incomplete. The glossy brochures, the documentaries, the magazine retrospectives, they all celebrated the cars, but rarely questioned who had actually built them. For our engineer, this silence became permanent. His name slipped further into obscurity. While those who had stood in front of cameras and press releases were remembered as pioneers. But what if the truth had been told? What if his story had been given the same stage as theirs? The narrative of the muscle car might look very different today. And here lies the power of forgotten history. By uncovering his contributions, we are forced to confront not just the glory of the cars themselves, but also the injustice woven into their creation. It raises questions that go beyond engines and horsepower. How many other brilliant minds were hidden because of the color of their skin? How many innovations were credited to the wrong people simply because of prejudice? This story is not just about the past, it challenges us in the present. Every time we celebrate the muscle car, we are also celebrating his work, whether we realize it or not. And maybe, just maybe, acknowledging the truth today can restore some of the recognition he was denied in his own lifetime. Because the legacy of America's first muscle car isn't just steel and horsepower, it's also the untold story of the black engineer who helped build it, only to be erased from history. Think about it: every roar of a restored GTO on a modern highway, every cheer at a classic car auction, every collector proudly polishing chrome under the sun. All of it carries the spirit of a man whose name was left out of the headlines. His story lingers like an echo, waiting for someone to finally listen. By the time historians began piecing together the origins of the muscle car era, the official version was already cemented. The same executives and public figures were credited again and again, their reputations growing larger with each retelling. Meanwhile, the engineer whose work helped make it possible remained in the shadows, known only to a handful of colleagues who remembered his brilliance. This silence isn't just an oversighted S, a reminder of how easily history can be shaped by those in power. Erasing his name didn't erase his contributions, but it did rob him of the recognition he deserved. It robbed future generations of an inspiring figure who broke barriers in an industry that rarely welcomed men like him. Imagine how many young engineers, especially young black students, might have seen a different path for themselves if his story had been told openly. And maybe that's why this story still matters today. It's not only about celebrating one forgotten man, it's about rewriting the narrative so that credit is finally given where it's due. Because history isn't just about the machines we build. It's about the people who build them. The cars will always be remembered. The question is, will we finally remember him too? As the final chapter of this story unfolds, one truth stands out. The muscle car era may have roared into history with chrome and gasoline, but it was built on the shoulders of unsung visionaries. Our black engineer was one of them, a man whose brilliance helped ignite a cultural movement, yet whose name was stripped from the spotlight. His silence in history books is not a reflection of his impact, but of a society that was not ready to recognize it. Even now, every restored GTO, every collector's auction, every magazine feature about the golden age of Detroit owes something to him. His work didn't just power engines, it powered dreams. It proved that raw innovation could break boundaries, even when the man behind it was forced to stand outside the circle of recognition. And that's the haunting beauty of his legacy. While his name was erased, his ideas could not be. They lived on in every car that thundered down American streets, in every drag race won by sheer horsepower, in every teenager who felt freedom behind the wheel for the first time. The cars remembered him, even when people did not. Today, telling his story is more than setting the record straight. It's a chance to restore dignity to a man who gave so much and received so little. It's a reminder that innovation has no color, that genius can come from anywhere, and that history must be rewritten to include every voice that shaped it. Because the muscle car revolution was never the work of a few, it was the work of many. And among them was a black engineer who changed American culture forever, even if history tried to erase him.